Good morning, Googlers. Thanks for being here. I'm Alan Davidson, your policy guy in Washington, D.C. And on behalf of the Visits team and Google NetPack, I'd like to welcome you to the first in our series of 2010 campaign forums. And today we're going to be joined by California's current Attorney General and a Democratic candidate for governor, Jerry Brown. As some of you probably recall, in 2008, we led and had an extraordinary series of visits from presidential candidates, Hillary Clinton, John McCain, now President Barack Obama. And we are going to be hoping to follow in those footsteps with a series in 2010 focused on statewide races. And today is the first of those. Short commercial message in next week. On Tuesday, we'll be joined by Insurance Commissioner Steve Poizner, who is one of the leading Republican candidates for the governor's race. And we invite you all to come. I should also note that we have invited Meg Whitman, another of the major candidates for the governor's race, despite her checkered past at a small company down the road. And we're very hopeful that she'll join us probably after the primaries. Just a short word about Governor Brown. At Google, we take pride in being fully engaged in the world around us, and that includes our own backyard and our own home state. So it is really appropriate and great that we're able to kick off this series by hearing Governor Brown's vision, or former Governor Brown's, Attorney General Brown's vision for California. Jerry Brown has a storied history in California politics. His father was governor of California from 1959 to 1967. He himself was elected to governor twice, in 1974 and then again in 1978. He's run for president 3 times. And in the 1992 race, in fact, which I remember very well, he refused to take contributions larger than $100 and used an 800 number, which we learned is still in existence today. He used an 800 number to raise funds. And I just say, the internet really could have helped you back then. So I hope you'll use it this time around more. In 1998, Brown ran for mayor of Oakland and won. He was reelected in 2002. Today, he is California's Attorney General and a Democratic candidate for governor. He is going to be joined today on the podium by our CEO, of course, Eric Schmidt, who will lead us in a short fireside chat, and then we will open it up for your questions. So please join me in welcoming Eric and Jerry Brown.
Well, thank you, Alan, and Governor, welcome to Google.
Thank you.
You have served our nation and our state for many, many years as a governor twice, and you're now running for governor again. Now, it seems to me that the state that you're thinking about becoming governor again, let's see, it's the 6th or 7th largest in the economy in the world. If it were, it would be a bankrupt country with $41 billion of debt. 1 million employees.
Wait a minute.
I haven't even answered my question.
We compare very favorably with Greece. And I want to explain why.
Let me just ask my question, Governor.
Well, this is not about answering your question. It's just a factoid. But go ahead.
What the question is, why in the world do you want to be governor of California?
All right.
You've already been it.
Yeah, I've already been it. But that was different. That's when the budget was 1/6 of what it is today, and we didn't have all these problems that have been created by all the governors that came after me. No, I have to mention the comparison with Greece. The relationship of the deficit in Greece to the national gross domestic product is about 12%. In the United States, federal government, it's 10%. In California, it's in the range of 1 to 1.5%. So when you only have a 1.5% deficit and your gross state product is 1.7 trillion in a bad year, you got a manageable problem. And I do think it's serious. It really is going to call forth for a lot of collaboration and courage, much of which we haven't seen in the past, but it's doable. Now, why I want to do this, That is a good question. I ask myself that over and over again. I am drawn to the task, perhaps as to the fire, but I have studied this government for most of my life. I studied it really when my father was governor and attorney general. And I did this for 8 years. I learned a tremendous amount. And then after that, I went on to do other things. And looking back, now I see it from the point of view of being a mayor for 8 years, being the lawyer for the governor and the state departments. So I've seen all the variations and aspects of what this government is, and also the politics in which it's embedded. And I really think that I could make a difference, and that I could grapple with these problems in a very effective way. And I was very glad to see there was a research report out that showed that the older people are, the greater their wisdom. This is now empirically based. And if we—
You're speaking to a young crowd.
Right. Well, I want to have them have something. You have something to look forward to. So, wisdom. There's a few other things that may not be in as great supply, but I would say that wisdom is something we need. Insight. This is not something you kind of wake up in the morning and look in the mirror and say, "Yeah, I'd like to be governor." Well, there's a lot to this, and I think we can pull it off, and we can pull Californians together. But it's going to have to be very creative. It's going to have to be very courageous, and I think it's going to be based on knowledge and skill and familiarity with what's at stake and what's involved. So that's why I'm doing it.
So when you were younger, less wise for both of us, you were quite an interesting governor. You, among other things, proposed a satellite for California.
I did. That's the reason I proposed the satellite was because we had a state astronaut in those days. Rusty Schweikart from Apollo 17 was a man that I met, and I made him my science advisor, and he was also
Doesn't
an
everyone
astronaut.
everyone has a satellite now? We have a satellite.
Right, but no governor at that point.
We have our own astronaut.
Do you have your own astronaut?
Yes, of course, we have a couple.
Yeah, but this is Google. This is Google, not the state of California, and we're much slower in our introduction of new thoughts. So the idea of the satellite, quite frankly, I used to ride the plane. At that time it was PSA, and I'd go back and forth from LA to Sacramento, and I saw all these government workers carrying their briefcases. I thought, moving all this weight around, couldn't we do it digitally? Couldn't we do it by satellite? And that was the genesis of the SYNCOM-4 satellite, which we could have had for $5 million back in 1978, had the legislature gone along with it.
And of course, this led you to your most famous name of the time.
Yeah, Governor Moonbeam, but I earned that not just from the state satellite, from many other things that I did. It had a certain glow.
Well, I've been dying to ask you this question. You were the governor when I first came to California, and you refused to go in the limo, and instead you insisted on going in the government Plymouth.
Yes.
And this Plymouth, by the way, is in the State Museum. And it has been suggested that because of the deficit, this Plymouth be sold to raise funds. When you also were governor, you refused to sleep in the governor's mansion. Was this some sort of rejection of father or something like that? Or what was going on in the 1970s?
You want me to link
California?
the Plymouth with the not
Mansion.
living in the mansion?
Yeah.
Well, it's very simple. I didn't live in the mansion because the mansion, first of all, was in the suburbs, 20 minutes away. Nancy Reagan had moved out of the old mansion, which is perfectly fine, but they didn't like the neighborhood. And so I thought me living in this new suburban mansion would be silly because it was huge by myself. So I thought a little apartment right across from the Capitol would not only be very convenient, but it was a contribution to revitalizing downtown Sacramento. And I did that in Oakland, I did it in Sacramento before, and I'm very interested in seeing 24-hour cities where people work and play and study in close proximity. As far as the Plymouth, now the reason why I sold Ronald Reagan, he was the governor before me, and he drove around, or was driven around in a bulletproof limousine that had belonged to J. Edgar Hoover, and I thought that would be a good thing to get rid of. And So that's, oh, but there was a reason for that. One time, we were in my father's limousine. It was a Lincoln when he was governor, and we went to a baseball game, the opening of Giant Stadium, and the people in the crowd pounded on the windows and were yelling at my father because he was running into some political difficulties at that time. So when all those people were pressing their face against the window and pounding on, I said, I'm never going to drive in a limousine.
Wow.
So that was kind of
Talk about a formative event.
So that was a formative event. I didn't.
Now,
I thought maybe if I was in a more modest car, they wouldn't pound on the window in quite the same way.
When, in the 1980s, you gained a reputation of being quite a progressive, and your opponents today are using this against you. But for example, in 1980, you talked about the need for universal health insurance and many other things that you tried to pioneer when you were governor. Has your view of all of this changed? Do you still think you were right back then?
Well, certainly in the field of alternative energy. And I would say that my thinking on efficiency and renewable energy was very much stimulated by the Arab oil embargo, the recession of 73 and 74, that was around this problem of excessive energy use. So California, within 8 years, became the world leader in renewable energy. And if we count from then till now, Californians have probably saved over $50 billion in energy efficiency because of our appliance standards and the building standards. So I think those ideas are right on. And at that time, we were talking about solar hot water. Now we're talking about solar photovoltaic, but it's the same thing. Introduction of new ideas. California is a state of imagination, and imagination is what we need to get out of the bind. We need to change the design. We need to introduce new ideas, and quite frankly, I've always been interested in the creative mind. I had a teacher once that I put him on the Board of Regents, and he inscribed one of the books he wrote. He said, the new comes out of the random. The new comes out of the random. I've been thinking a lot about that. Now, some people think I am a little random, but unless you open the possibilities, you rarely come up with something new. If you're rigidly programmed, if you're managing what is, you can't create what really needs to be. And that was the spirit then. I think it would be the spirit.
Well, and then you ran for president a couple of times, 3 times, and then eventually you ended up as mayor of Oakland. And I suspect that of all of the public service roles you enjoyed, you probably enjoyed that the most after figuring out how to do it. Is that true?
That is true.
What was it like being mayor of Oakland?
Well, it's very different than running for president, running for mayor, that is. And being mayor is very different than being governor. You don't have to fly around in airplanes. Everything is within 15 minutes of where you are. What's interesting about being mayor is you're in one place, and you really get to understand and know people, street corners, schools, policemen, criminals, businesses. And I was able to go into the city, which had a very undeveloped downtown, a lot of parking lots, a lot of crime, and to actually bring in thousands of people, thousands of new condominiums and apartments, new art galleries, new businesses, an art school, restoration of the Fox Theater. So the downtown now is a very vital place. And what I really enjoyed about being mayor of Oakland was to be able to revitalize the downtown next to the BART. So this BART system that my father had started back in the 60s, all those many years now became the catalyst for revitalizing downtown Oakland, because it's only 12 minutes from San Francisco and 5 minutes from Berkeley and 15 minutes from Walnut Creek. So it became a hub, an urban village with art galleries, with schools, with commercial art theaters, and people living there. So building that, seeing stuff come out of the ground, that's very exciting. As a governor, you're dealing with more laws and bills and appointments, much longer range, more abstract, and not the concrete change and expression that you see as being a mayor of a city.
Have your views on progressive issues changed much? Because they don't seem to have, if I look at your support for example, against Prop 8, I don't see much change in your views there. Can you talk about AB 32, Prop 8, some of the big political issues that the state faces?
Well, certainly environment was something that was really coming to the fore in the 70s. Remember, the Earth Day was 1970. The National Environmental Policy Act was 69. The California Environmental Quality Act was the same year. And this had all been put into effect under Republican administrations, Reagan in California, Nixon in Washington. And then when I came in 1975, we really began to implement these principles. And then, the rubber hit the road and there was a lot of resistance. But during my 8 years, I really promoted renewable energy, protection of the coast, protection of wild rivers, protection of the redwoods, all these different quality of life, ecosystem questions came to the fore, and it really, I was in the spirit of California, the spirit of the times, and I think today, more than ever, these things are salient. We now have climate change confronting us. So I'd say, if anything, the issues that were more inchoate and embryonic in 75, 82 are now in full force in their urgency and their importance.
When you think about how you're going to serve us as governor again, and as you pointed out, the state is 6 times larger, an enormous economic and cultural force today, but even the Terminator couldn't run this government. The fundamental problems, as you know, have to do with an over-reliance on higher income tax, which is seasonal, right? In other words, up and down, and so the state goes from boom to bust. A highly difficult redistricting, where the seats are quite safe. There's very little competition for seats. A requirement for a budget agreement of 2/3, which is only in 4 or 5 states, and very difficult to achieve in any political environment, but especially in the rancorous times when we have little money and all of these state services and people coming to the trough, all of the usual pressure groups and so forth. So when you think about that and you walk into it now, what will you do differently? How will you approach it differently? How will you not end up as the Terminator governor, Governor Schwarzenegger, who started off with enormous public support, but unfortunately, and is a man I certainly respect, is now in approval rating similar to that of Gray Davis, who he replaced?
Well, definitely. The legislature has about 15% approval. The governor has 25%. And it's very hard to expect the people to entrust too much responsibility to such discredited offices or officials. And I think it's fair to say that approaching the government itself and the politics in which it's embedded or which it's enclosed, it does take knowledge. If science requires training and preparation, if artistic production requires this, if business requires this, I think you could say the same for this very different world of politics and government. Some people say, well, this government's just a business. You get a good business experience. But actually, there's quite a bit of difference between being a CEO of business and being a governor. First of all, the CEO often has very good relations with the board of directors. Sometimes you get some of your key people on the board. The board of directors for the governor is the legislature. The legislature is independent, picked by the people, and by constitutional provision and inclination is out there checking, going against, and really putting the pressure on. And you've got to woo, cajole, persuade. You don't order. Second thing in government is you can't fire very many people. Mm-hmm. There's something called civil service. People have a right to their job. Very hard to remove people. Number two, you have collective bargaining. Every rule you're talking about has to be embodied in a contract. Very different. And then, so you say, hey, I want to fire 10,000 people. No, it doesn't work that way. Third, lots of public exposure. You can't deal with, there's not too much privacy here. This is an open, transparent venue. And that's why I think the mastering the skills of public administration in the elective arena requires a great deal of patience, insight, empathy, understanding all the different points of view. If you just think of it, you mentioned Proposition 8. Sacramento has a representative from Kern County that I think voted for Proposition 8 80%. It also has representatives from San Francisco that voted the opposite way. And they're all there and somehow you've got to get them all on the same page. It takes skill, and it takes persuasion, and then in working on the inside game, which is often deals, crafting these compromises, but then out to the public, you have to inspire, you need dreams, you have to inspire, you need an eloquence that is very different than the skill set for working in the corridors of the Capitol. So on balance, there's a lot to learn. And I feel that, getting the training so long ago, then seeing the consequences of things that worked and things that didn't work. In fact, I started a law called the Political Reform Act of 1974, and when I was mayor, there was one of the provisions that would have stopped me from promoting economic growth. So I went to court and actually had part of the law that I wrote invalidated. And I think it's a very salutary experience to both make laws and unmake them all in the same lifetime, because you see every law has unintended consequences. So I think these are the ingredients that I've developed to make a very positive outcome.
What have you learned by being Attorney General after being governor and mayor?
I've learned that often the department heads and the governor don't know all the things that are going on. And there are these lawsuits, there's a number of areas in water and prisons and other areas. And as Attorney General, I have 1,100 lawyers working, defending the state or doing other kinds of legal actions. And first of all, there's so many lawsuits. There's so much complexity. And wrestling that stuff to the ground is very challenging. And I think oftentimes the state makes agreements that causes us to pay a lot of money later. We also see that sometimes the governor wants to cut a budget, but then you find out people go to court and they get the cuts eliminated. So you've got to know the laws are not only state laws, they're local laws, they're the Constitution, and they're the federal laws. And we're enmeshed in all these contradictory commands. And so moving through that complexity is something I didn't appreciate, just how much of it there was. And another thing I didn't appreciate as governor, because each governor signs about 800 to 1,000 new laws a year. And when you pass a law, somebody's got to enforce that darn thing. It isn't just do good. It's if you don't do good, you can get sued. You can go to jail or pay a tax. And as Attorney General, my office is often called upon to enforce these laws. And businesses run afoul of many of them, and there's just tens of thousands of thou shalt not. And the density and the reach of the invasive, minute prescriptions is breathtaking. And I've developed a very healthy distaste for legislation.
Interesting. Speaking as a lawyer, governor, mayor, and so forth. When you, another question has to do with the maturation of your own understanding of the role of public safety. Because one of the things that you did when you went into Oakland was you helped fix some of the chronic crime problems. As Attorney General, you've obviously dealt with a very significant prison union, police forces, and so forth, and the CHP and so forth. Do you have a view now of how you would manage the public safety functions? The three strikes you're out laws, the sum of all of those are a very large percentage of California's budget.
Right. It's the prison system. When you say the crime, you've got crime is you have criminal law, and then you have local police from the cities, you have county sheriffs, then you have the highway patrol, and then you have prisons, and then you have state parole. So it's a big system. Just taking the state piece of that, which is not the biggest, the prisons consume 10% of the state budget. When I was governor, they consumed between 2 and 3%. Okay. So when you see a growth, call it 7%. 7% on a $100 billion budget is $7 billion. That's a big difference. Then you say, what is it? Well, you got 160,000 people locked up. 120,000 leave every year. So every month, 10,000 people walk out the door and 10,000 people walk in. It is the best managed hotel system in the world. There is never a vacant bed, or a vacant cell, I should say. And so the real question, people talk about reducing prison overcrowding. The problem is when you let them out, they want to come back because the median educational attainment is 7th grade. There's massive dope addiction. There's a lot of anger, and there's almost no rehabilitation or experience of work while they're in prison. The prisons are basically, people are idle for years. Once, when I was young, I was told that idleness is the devil's workshop. Well, the devil has a lot of workshops in California, like 33 massive prisons, where tens of thousands of men, very vigorous, very energetic, are sitting around doing nothing. I believe that work in prison, more education, more drug treatment, re-entry, I think we can restructure the way the criminal justice and crime control and prison and incarceration and sanction system work. And I think we can save money, and I think we can improve public safety, and we can increase the productivity of all the individuals involved. But it takes knowing, understanding, and being focused, because the crime prison is only one issue. You have the taxes and budget, and then you have water, and then you have schools, and then you have highways, and then you have the high-speed rail. All these things are pretty, there's a lot of complexity there. And that's why I say it's really important to spend the time understanding the different key elements of what goes into the government structure, so you know where to go at, what you need to do to get real change.
When you look at the scale of the budget, education is actually a huge part of what we're trying to do.
Yeah, the biggest part.
And as you know, there are a series of initiatives that require massive spending on education. Many people believe that there's a very, very strong teachers union involved as well. How will you change California education? I know you're very interested in, for example, public charter schools. How will you make it different as one of the biggest issues California faces?
Well, I want to say something about the Teachers Union of the California Teachers Association, California Federation of Teachers. I have 2 charter schools that do not have tenure, and there's no union representative. And yet we are highly challenged to produce the high scores that we're looking for. We're doing very well. The schools are doing excellent in college admission. But for example, in mathematics, in the military school, last year,
the Oakland Military
the
School?
Oakland Military, I formed the Oakland Military
Yes.
Institute, 500 kids, 6th grade through 12, and the Oakland School for the Arts, 6th grade through 12. Well, in the military school, we're still around 20% proficient in math, and yet we can hire any math teacher we want. We have after school, we have Saturday class. There are embedded challenges, deficiencies in low-income neighborhoods, low-income families, where the income is very unstable, very inadequate, lots of stress, gangs in the neighborhood. And when you translate that into the development of the thinking of the kids, they come in school, it's pretty hard to get them interested in algebra. The motivation is a big challenge. So you've got to attract the teachers, particularly math and science teachers. You've got to motivate them. You have to hold students and kids to account, because they have to take responsibility. And you have to have that bond between teacher and student. And there's a lot of focus on national standards, on data collection, but teaching is a mentoring kind of relationship. It's one human being, the teacher, and these students, and the relationship, the exchange, the identification, that's crucial in stimulating learning. And I think we're losing a lot of that humanistic aspect of education as we try to find mechanistic ways of producing outcomes. There's a lot of fashion in education. Because the waves of reform keep occurring and I've seen them over the last 30 years. I think we got to focus on the basics. You got to have discipline in the schools. You need inspiration. You have to find where the kids are emotionally and intellectually, and you have to move them along in a sequential, accountable way. So I really feel the experience that I've had in starting these 2 schools from scratch, developing the leaders, getting rid of the ones who didn't work, and getting new ones, and over again, seeing the parents. And I've learned a great deal. And I think, for example, the theme, a school based on art, a school based on the military school framework, leadership, competition, esprit de corps. There can be other themes, hospitality industry, math and science. I think we need to give an overall thematic context so that every kid in the school knows what's expected and identifies with it and chooses it. so that there'd be other choices in the school district where they could go. So I'm very confident that California can make real progress in education.
I'd like to talk a little bit about the election. Today there are two primary Republican challengers. It appears as though you're the only significant candidate for the Democratic primary.
By the way, that was not of my own choosing.
Yeah.
I certainly was looking forward to a lot more candidates, but they all went away.
They all went away, and so it looks like you'll be the Democratic nominee, conventional wisdom, and you've been relatively careful about getting started. You face an extremely well-funded opponent in Meg Whitman, and Steve Poizner, of course, we'll see next week. What's the plan to win for you?
Well, the plan to win is not to waste scarce campaign funds. I've been hard at work at this, work at the fundraising, work at developing a campaign team, holding down expenses. Certainly the way one runs a campaign might be an indication how one would run government. And I run a very frugal operation. I think.
Well, I called your office and you answered the phone. That's frugal.
I don't know. We have more people. We have a lot of people now.
Maybe you were doing the lunch phone.
Well, I pick up the phone because if it rings more than twice, I don't like that. I think I want a prompt response.
I'm not making this up, by the way.
I'm always interested in who's calling. So I got a day job called the Attorney General. We have a lot of issues. We have antitrust issues. We have environment issues. We have criminal issues. We've got gang problems. You have prescription drugs, underground economy, a lot of things. So I'm working on that. And I've got to raise the money. I don't just go write a check.
Well, what's the money situation?
Well, I have about $15.5 million in the bank. I need to raise many millions more.
And why do you need so much money?
Because the focal point of campaigning are television ads for the most part. And the ads are enormously expensive. They cost you $100,000 for one ad. And the key in the election are the decline to state voters. And the decline to state voters are often not reading editorials, not reading political journals, but they are watching a sporting event, an entertainment show, the Olympics. And if one can buy a commercial and then you send your message to that person without even asking their permission, over time, you get your favorable impression over. And so a great deal, if not the predominant part of the campaign, will be through the mechanism of TV commercials. Now, that's not the only story. There's the press, both written and electronic. There's the internet. There's people-to-people meetings. And over time, not in the month of April, but between April and November, there will be a lot of back and forth among the candidates.
But when does that happen? I mean, it seems to me that people are not engaged today in the governor's race for something.
But you can't ask people to be engaged every day or even every week between now and November. It reaches a crescendo September, October, leading up to the election. That's always the way it is. The interest level. Now, there are political junkies that are they're on the internet every day reading about this stuff. But that's a very, very small subset of the number of people who are going to vote.
But are you going to do a debate?
Well, I'd love to do debates. I hope that will be possible.
So when will the debates be?
I would tend to think the debates would be in the fall. What happens now in April and May, unless it's pretty earth-shaking, is not going to shape the thinking of people in September and October. And there will be changes in the budget. There will be changes in the world events and in news in Washington. And all that affects the conversation and the debate in the campaign. So my thought is very deliberate, well-paced campaign, not wasting unnecessary money. I mean, these other candidates, I mean, I think Whitman has spent already $50 million. I think Steve has spent $3 or $4 million. That's an enormous sum of money. I've spent probably $500,000. But I think the spending needs to be modulated for the biggest bang for the buck. And I think we'll get that. And it'll be not only on television, it'll be on internet, it'll be people to people, and it will be through the medium of public debate, both like on a forum like this, but also across the airwaves. She says, he says, and back and forth. All that creates news and facts and factoids that will allow people to make their own decision. And I'm confident that by the time of the election in November, people will have enough information to decide which candidate is on their side, which candidate is going to fight for their interests, and who do they most identify with. And so I'm not at all concerned that there will be a lack of information. If anything, there will be a surfeit of information, and people will be kind of tired of it and want to turn it off.
Why don't we get some questions from the audience and get our audience to participate as well. We have mics here. My final question is, in the craft of politics and of getting yourself elected, you're saying it's not going to be enough to just have the Democratic Party, the Democratic voters. Is that a change from your first 1970s?
Well, the decline of state voters when I ran for governor, I believe, was no more than 3%. It's now 20%.
Yeah.
But even registered Democrats and registered Republicans are not totally committed to their party. So I think if you want to look at it just schematically, you can be confident that 80 to 90% of the Republicans are going to vote for the Republican candidate. 80 to 90% of Democrats will vote for the Democratic candidate. So there's a marginal group in both parties that could move back and forth based on the campaign and based on what they read and see. Then you have this group in the middle, the declined state, which often don't have as much interest as the committed people. And their focus will emerge as we get closer to the election, but they will be decisive. And their concerns are not the excitement of the base, as we call it, the hardcore Republican, the strong Democrat. No, this declined state is more skeptical, more dubious of government, and they're the ones who will ultimately decide who the next governor is.
Let's take our first question, and let me remind you all that you're on the record. Yes, sir.
Hi. Eric asked a question about the state's governability, and your response was about your knowledge of inside baseball. I wonder if there's anything about anything structural about the way the state is governed that you would be inclined to change, and if there is, what would you do?
Good. I'm glad you give me a chance to elaborate on that. There is this two-thirds vote, but the two-thirds vote existed when my father was governor, when Reagan was governor, when Warren was governor. It wasn't that big of an impediment. There's something else going on. The polarization between different groups in the society, as expressed in the two parties, is much sharper, much more antagonistic. And that's true at the national level, it's true at the state level. Something is going on in the society. Perhaps it's the slowdown in growth, zero-sum game, people aren't as accommodating, and that's just another barrier. But I do believe that at the end of the day, enough people think, including legislators, of California first. I think they see themselves as individuals, as members of a larger community than just their partisan affiliation, and that's what I would work on. So it isn't just the two-thirds vote or the reapportionment or one of those things. So we can make some changes. There's a reapportionment commission. There's a vote to make the primaries open.
Are you, in fact, worried about the reapportionment commission? Because as we know, it's private citizens, or do you think it's going to work?
No, I'm not worried about it at all. I mean, this reapportionment business is, they say legislation is it's like making salami or something, or bologna. I think the reapportionment will have some of the same characteristics. But the fact is, people are grouping themselves. People in Bakersfield think differently than people in San Francisco. And people in Orange County think differently than people in Alameda County. So there's a grouping of like for whatever reasons. And so even if you redivide the legislative pie in different ways, I don't think there'll be a big difference. There may be 3 or 4 seats, but generally we have the same problem. There's more spending than there is revenues. There's a north and south dispute on water. There's differences on what education should be, on the criminal law, labor relations. These are still built in, and reapportionment, I think, will have some impact, but it's not decisive.
Yes, sir.
Can you discuss your vision for the future of college education in California?
Yeah, my vision is more abundant college education. My father was governor. He was able to build 3 new universities. It was virtually free. And now the tuition increases, elimination of courses. I think we have to maintain a very powerful commitment to higher education, as well as making sure the kids are prepared to get there. And that is the engine of growth. It's also the foundation of citizenship and our community. So I can't think of anything much more important than a vibrant, accessible university system.
The issue, just to make clear, is that both the college community system as well as the UC system, of which you were the chairman of the board and would become the chairman of the board again, are really very, very seriously hit by the cutbacks right now.
They are hit.
And it really does affect.
And you know, it's good to kind of compare what happens over time. When you look at a problem today, it's helpful to see what were the ingredients over time that have constituted the problem. And today, as I said, the prison spending is 10, not 2 or 3. The spending on the health care for the poor, our Medi-Cal program, that's around 18% of the budget, used to be 10. So if you take those two, you're talking about 15%. 15% on $100 billion, that's $12 to $15 billion that now is going to something that it didn't go to 30 years ago. So I think we have to find savings in those programs, and we have to reprioritize, because there is part of our duty is to take care of those who are less fortunate and very vulnerable, and the other part of our responsibility, very, very important, is to stimulate new thinking, new ideas, skill sets, imagination. And there has to be the right balance, because unless we're inventing and designing the new, then we're stagnating. But if we're completely oblivious to the vulnerable, then we're a very harsh society. So that's where I think wisdom comes in.
Go ahead.
Attorney General Brown, thanks so much for coming and sharing your thoughts with us. Can you discuss the impact that the ballot initiative process has had on the governability of California, particularly since Prop 13, which was passed around your time as governor?
Yeah, Prop 13 passed in '78. By the way, it attracted the highest turnout ever for a state primary election. And since that time, almost right afterwards, one ballot measure after another, constraining the governor, the legislature, setting down more and more precise rules on how things need to be done. So what you have here is you have a chess game of government with fewer and fewer moves. And that is driven by the frustration. So people have a widespread disgust at the mechanism of representation. So people then put on the ballot, often special interests, some attractive sounding measure, and people vote for it. But the more they embed the system with these constraints, the more difficult it is to perform, and the performance declines, and people want more and more initiatives to correct it. So we're in a cycle, a rather destructive cycle. And to get out of that, first of all, we need to get beyond that. And I think the way we need to get beyond it is to make the governing process more transparent, to make the key elements of government, the education, higher and K through 12, the prison system, the water, the energy, the roads, the medical care, make those key elements transparent, accessible, understandable, so people know what are their tax dollars going for, what is it doing, and where are the areas where we can modify. And I think and quite frankly, I think I can conduct that kind of transparent process that will reconnect the citizenry to their own government, something that I think has very much been lost in recent years.
Go ahead.
Hello. When you are talking about education, you talked a lot about your philosophy and about the teacher-student connection. You mentioned a little bit about the union. I would like to, could you be a little more specific about how that would translate into your actions as a governor? Would you push policies against standardized testing, for example? Or how would you interact with the teachers' union? How would it affect, and how important is it to you? How would it affect your policies and what you do as a governor?
Yeah, I do think that this rush to national standards needs to be carefully evaluated. California has had a testing and national tests. There are more and more tests. We treat third graders almost like we do young lawyers taking the bar review, a bar test. In 3 days, intense. There's SAT tests. There's the state tests. Then you have your normal tests in the classroom. So we need balance here. And it's well to remember, by the way, that 30 years ago, there was virtually no talk of national standards, national tests, pay for performance. These are all kind of new ideas. And we ought to test those ideas before we adopt them wholesale. So I do think variety, we all learn in different ways. Imagination is crucial and people learn and unfold in their lives differently, and different people are interested in different things. So yes, we need some core standards, but I think the states ought to have a wide latitude in what they develop. I think schools also you can't let the curriculum be colonized by whatever the fashion of the moment is in requiring these tests and everything, and the data from the test, then judging the teachers. It becomes a very centralized and rigid system. And I think decentralization is very important, and the tolerance of disparate outcomes. And I think through competition, through transparency, people will gravitate to what is best. But I do think the humanistic tradition is being lost. Schools were conceived not as workforce factories creating inputs to the workforce, but they were seen as places where disparate Americans could come together and learn the common experience of what it is to be American and what it is to be a citizen. And when you look at the gang problem in certain schools, as well as the failure rate, you find out that citizenship and morality and ethics is quite deficient on the agenda. So yes, basic reading, math, science, literature, all those skills and the pathway to higher education, very important. But you still, at the end of the day, from the time of Thomas Jefferson, we've always assumed that a democracy can't work without an informed citizenry, and critical thinking, as well as basic common values, are the mission of the public school, and equally as important to some of the more recent demands that are being put on it. Yeah.
Let's go ahead. Next question.
Yeah. What are your thoughts on the calls for a constitutional convention?
I think the convention could be a vehicle to either as another step in the debate in resolving some of these California challenges. For example, the absolute embedded gap between revenue and spending. So at some point, a convention might be the vehicle to carry on the next level of the debate. What do we really want as Californians? What kind of a budget? What is our government? What should it be? And that's not a decision for one person or 120 people. It's really, in a democracy, for the people themselves. And then the problem becomes, how do we facilitate that collective debate and ultimately collective decision? The legislature is the key arena for that. Initiatives also play a role, but given the breakdown where we are, it might require at some point a convention to take the next step in resolving some of these tough issues. I don't think they can all be resolved in the legislature alone. At some point, the people are going to have to weigh in on what kind of a California future do they want, and what role do they see the government playing in that.
Do you think it'll happen when you're governor?
It could, and it's certainly a mechanism that I'm looking at, not as the first line of attack on the stalemate and the breakdown, but as certainly a real live possibility of something that should be seriously entertained.
So we're running out of time. We have 3 more questions, so let's have these be the last questions. Yes, sir, go ahead.
Hi. Taxes in California. You think we're taxing about the right level, taxing too much, taxing too little? And what do you think will happen under your administration?
Well, if past is prologue, when I was governor, contrary to what you might see in some of these ads, There was never an increase in the sales tax, the income tax during my years, or the gas tax, wine tax, any of this. We were blessed with a lot of vibrant economy, created 1.9 million jobs. Today, we're in trouble. And I've said there will be no new taxes unless the people themselves want them and vote for them. And that's part of the larger question of what do we really need to be doing in government, and how do we resolve these very sharp disputes, because there are very different views of this. And that's where I would like to see a very transparent process that enables the people of this state to make decisions. And at some point in the legislative process, we may well have to go to the people and get their view of how to resolve the budget gap. But I think the first line of attack here is to make the most efficient government, not to try to do it all in 1 year. I mean, when you're facing a lot of what we're missing now in terms of funding came from the Wall Street debacle, the disappearance today, measured today in real terms, of over $11 trillion in wealth. That was destroyed out of this mortgage debacle, the securitization of all those subprime mortgages and what have you. That unregulated Wall Street outcome is now causing suffering all over the world, including states, cities, and school districts. So we shouldn't punish or diminish the important work of schooling and healthcare and research and development in universities because we had this excess of the debt-driven and fueled bubble. I think we have to take take 2 or 3 years, or maybe longer, to work to finance a workout where we bring revenue and spending into line. And I certainly would make every effort I could to live within the revenues that the people would make available.
Yes, sir.
So as a follow-up to that on the spending side, you may have seen this recent article by Joel Kotkin in which he pointed out that Texas, a similar state to us in size and demography, spends far, far less. The state government spends far, far less per capita, and yet their outcomes in terms of the core functions of state government, roads, schools, and so forth, are not appreciably worse in quality than ours. What, if anything, do you think we can learn from the experiences of other states about how to get better value for the money that the state government spends?
Well, one example of that would be in the Texas state prisons. The cost per inmate for medical care is about $3,700, and in California it's about $14,000. So I actually called the people in Texas, say, how do you do it? And they've come out here and have been meeting with both the university, because they have a medical capability, and the Department of Corrections to examine, are there much cheaper ways of doing it? Now, there's some explanations for that. We have a very liberal Ninth Circuit court, and they're hearing literally thousands of lawsuits against the state of California on Medi-Cal, but also on, just sticking with the one example, the prison system. And the state has been forced to spend billions of dollars in response to all this litigation. And as Attorney General, I am engaged on the other side in fighting it. That's why I have a very clear understanding of the excesses that have been brought about. And I think we've got to deal with it in court. We have to deal with it in the legislature. We've got to deal with it through management. And I think the prison system is one. I think you can look all across government. If you say, are there ways we can do it more efficiently? Yes, we can. Do we have different kind of politics and pressures? We do. And you get certain benefits, and you have certain costs when you're in the state of California, and you got to manage them. We're not Texas, we're California. But that doesn't mean to say we can't get a lot more efficient and a lot more creative and generate a lot more wealth. That's what we got to do. And at the end of the day, remember, we had a gross state product of $1.7 trillion. There's a lot of wealth creation. I think the key task here is how do we encourage the continuous growth in that wealth creation effort by the people of the state, and where we can learn something from Texas or New York or Vermont, let's learn it. But even after we learn things, putting it through the process, lots of resistance, but that's no reason why we shouldn't try, and we can do a lot better.
Thank you, and you'll have the honor of the last question.
Thanks again for joining us. The technology available to you during your previous gubernatorial campaign is clearly different. How do you plan to engage voters using the internet in your current campaign?
Well, we certainly have a lot of going on in social media. You can go to the domain jerrybrown.org and you can get involved. We have Facebook. We're looking. I am seeing, when we look at a campaign that will spend between $100 and $200 million, we're not going to be able to equal that sum. So we are looking to the internet. We're looking to grassroots. We're looking to people from different communities self-organizing in ways that will join the debate, join the discussion, join our campaign. And so we're going to take advantage of every tool that is available through the internet and other technologies so that we can be competitive. And it will take time to ramp this up, but we definitely feel that is going to be a key element in engaging people and getting information to the voters so that by the time they go in November, they will be able to decide which candidate do I most identify with, who do I think will fight for me. And definitely some of the tools you develop here at Google are something we're looking at.
Well, Governor, your service to California has been a part of, I think, all of our lives for many, many years. You've dedicated your whole literally your whole adult life to public service and to trying to make the world a better place. I think all of us have seen your sensibility and your approach, and I think all of us wish you very good luck in this upcoming election. So thank you so much for coming to Google.
Thank you very much. Thank you. Thank you.